Our hope is to study the considerations of Islam and the political order. Sometimes the consideration of the political order is that of man in contrast to, or even in separation from God. This is not our presupposition. On the contrary, we begin with the recognition of God, the Creator, of His sovereignty over all of His creation. And secondly, in this same context, we continue with the sense of humanity as the image of God, the vice-regent of God. Thirdly, and this brings us to the political order, we need to find out how the vice-regents of God themselves can work together to exercise their regency in these times, and in that way to continue the work of divine creation through time. This, we hope, will be a real contribution to understanding how we can have a political order which will be progressive and peaceful, creative, and worthy of humankind.
It's my pleasure to be among you, dear distinguished guests, Dr. Conway, Ayatollah Arabi, and the rest of you. In fact, when I came here in 2000 to start studying Western philosophy, to complete my research and seeking of knowledge in that field, and at the same time started teaching law, Islamic law, and other Islamic studies here at Catholic University. And when I was really welcomed warmly by founders, by fathers, by scholars, including staff and students of this university, I realized that there are many gap and misunderstanding going on between this, at least these two great religion of Islam and Christianity. And I realized that the best way of filling this kind of gap is to establish a kind of dialogue, sharing of ideas, exchange of scholars. And so far, with the help of all our friends here and Iran, we have been able to communicate and send and bring more than maybe 30 to 40 scholars in and out. And this seminar also, this conference, I can tell you is, as far as I know, the most important event happening after Islamic Revolution of Iran in this kind of quality of our guests. So I'm very pleased. I hope this is a good beginning of further dialogue, which in the future, hopefully very soon, will lead to bring peace and love between these two great nations and two great governments. I hope for that, we pray for that, and thank you all for coming here and sharing your time and your ideas with us. God bless you all.
In introducing Sheikh Hussein Nasr, he is one of, and he has been for many decades now, one of the most outstanding scholars in Islam on the global stage. To me, he has been an inspiration for several decades. And what I have admired about his work long before I met him is that he is consistent as the northern star. He does not shift his position with shifting political fortunes. He is examining the world through the lens of a Muslim scholar. And he is doing it scrupulously, wherever it may take him. He is in the finest traditions of Islamic scholarship. You know his achievements, you know about his books, you know about his many awards. I will not go into that because that is all available. For me, I want to sum it up by saying that if you want to understand Islam today, read Hussein Nasr. And with that, it is my honor and pleasure to request him to make his presentation to us this morning.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the infinitely good, the all-merciful. I'm very grateful for your kind introduction. You yourself have achieved so much since you joined us here in Washington at a very difficult moment in the relations between Islam and the West. And I hope, inshallah, you will continue to do so in the future. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this conference. I usually do not speak about politics. Although someone in Iran has written a PhD thesis on my political ideas, I would like to see it myself to learn something from it. But this is such an important conference that when Dr. Iravani and my very old friend, Professor McLean, asked me to inaugurate this conference, I said I shall be very glad to do so. And what I want to do is to throw the gauntlet, a challenge before the Islamic world itself, as far as the development and formulation of a contemporary Islamic philosophy of politics, or political philosophy, is concerned. Of course, Islam, like all religions, has been concerned from the very beginning with the whole of life. Every religion seriously has to be concerned with the whole of life. And even Christianity, which speaks of giving unto Caesar what is Caesar's and giving unto God what is God's, when it developed, a whole civilization had to be concerned with the whole of life and therefore the domain of politics. But Islam in particular emphasized from the very beginning the fact that what we call politics, which in Arabic is called a siyasa, which is very interesting, which means how to make a horse behave. That's the root of the word for politics in Arabic, siyasa. Was concerned with the domain which we call politics. It's reflected already in the Quran and the Hadith, and the segmentation of life into one being religious and the other one being non-religious and political was totally alien and remains totally alien to the Islamic worldview. On the basis of the twin sources of Islamic revelation, that is the Quran and the Hadith, and in the case of Shiism, the sayings of the Imams, which complement the Nabawi Hadith, and they're called therefore Walawi, that is Hadith associated with Imams. And this is quite important, the experience of the Islamic community going back to Medina and all of the later developments. Islamic political thought developed. It's a field in which Islamic civilization has been extremely rich. We first of all have the judicial, the fiqhi study of politics. This has a long tradition in the Sunni world, going back to the very first crystallization of it with Imam Abu Hanifa, with later on Al-Mawardi, Ibn Taymiyyah, and so forth. And in the Shiite world, it flowered especially after the Safavid period, when there was already an established political entity in the name of Ithna Ashari Shiism, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, early 20th century, in the writings of such people as Naraqi, Ayatollah Naini, who were essentially jurisprudence. Then we have a parallel theological, Kalami development of Islamic political thought. We have in the Sunni world, of course, the famous example of Ghazali, the Persian theologian from Khorasan, and Allama Hilli, who was Shiite, and many, many other figures. This is not a lecture on the list of various figures in Islamic thought. I just want to bring out the different schools which have dealt with Islamic political thought over the ages. It's interesting that as far as Shiism is concerned, Ithna Ashari Shiism, with which we're concerned today, that is the Shiism predominant in Iran and Iraq today, that kalam or theology began to wane. We have very little really significant Shiite theology in contrast to philosophy in the last few centuries. And that's why there's not a single book in any language in the history of Shiite theology in the sense of kalam. It's a quite interesting subject which you people should pay attention to and try to write one in Tehran now. Then we have, I think what is much more important, the Islamic philosophical tradition, which dealt with Islamic political thought on the basis of both those experiences and, of course, the source of the Quran and Hadith, and the philosophical traditions which had entered into the Islamic world, and therefore facing a challenge, intellectual, from outside of the Islamic world. That's why this tradition is so important for us. Ibn Arabi, who wrote the Tadbir al-Mamlakat al-Insaniya, that is the governance of the human state, and the actual directives and practices of such political units as the Safavids, which began as a Sufi order, or Ahmad ibn Idris and the Idrisis in North Africa, created a Sufi-oriented, but today in Iran we would call it Irfani-oriented, because the word Sufism became anathema after the end of the Safavid period, but nevertheless I shall use it. Sufi or Irfani, Gnostic-oriented understanding even of the political order. It's interesting that in modern times, the most significant political Islamic event of the 20th century, that is the revolution in Iran in 1979, its founder, Ayatollah Khomeini, made use of all of these four different sources for his later political theory in his life, but not purely philosophical. To all of these were added during Islamic history sociological studies of Islamic political life. And of course, chief among them, Ibn Khaldun, whose work is not that even only of a historian, only of a sociologist, but a political meditation upon the sociology and social structure of Islamic civilization. Now, in contrast to this very rich intellectual tradition concerning political life, in the 19th century, when people who were so-called reformers, I don't like that word very much, I think most of them were deformers, but they're called reformers anyway. From the 19th century onward, such as Jamaluddin Asadabadi, known as Al-Afghani outside of Iran, Muhammad Abdo, his student, and in the 20th century, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Maulana Abul Alam Maududi, the founder of Jamaat Islamiyya Pakistan with its correlative organization in India. When you look at their writings on politics, it is very little intellectual in content. That is, they do not face the intellectual challenges which the Islamic world was beginning to face from the West. I've always said that the predominant challenge of the West to the Islamic world is in contrast to the Mongol invasion, not military, but intellectual. There are also military and economic challenges, obviously, look at Afghanistan and Iraq, but the primary challenge was and remains intellectual, and these very famous movements, even in the case of people like Jamaluddin Asadabadi, who in Iran was studying Islamic philosophy, and their glosses on the Asfar of Mullah Sadra in his own library, which he gave to Haji Amin Zarb, which is in the Majlis in Tehran, in the Majlis library. And Maulana Maududi, who translated 2 volumes of the Asfar from Arabic into Urdu in his young days. He hid that. Nobody knew about that. My own son, who's a specialist in this field, finally discovered it. I was absolutely astounded myself. They hid this knowledge, and they only spoke from the point of view of Islamic law and a kind of political thought that was not deeply rooted in a deep intellectual understanding of the issues that were involved. Now, what are the issues that are involved? I want to pose a number of questions, which I think the illustrious scholars here and later on will, inshallah, address, which I believe are all of philosophical and intellectual content. First of all, who is authorized and qualified to formulate Islamic political thought? Who authorizes us here to stand here and talk about Islamic political thought? Where does the authority come from? Now, classical Islamic civilization had an answer for that. But in the present day context, this is essentially either a philosophical question or it's a question of power. We say, all right, the person who wields the sword, in today's terms, the gun, he has the authority, then there's no debate, no discussion. But or the rule of the people or both. People must understand that Western political life was based on gradually taking away political rule from God and handing it to the people. In the old days, the kings ruled in Europe as a divine right of kings. We're here in a Catholic university. The classical theories of St. Thomas Aquinas and other great Catholic theologians were based on the idea that society should be ruled by God. The hierarchy of authorities, that is the Pope, who was the highest, who then anointed the rulers of Europe, the kings of France, and so forth and so on, through the rites that we all know, and bequeathed upon them a vertical authority that came ultimately from God, who then allowed them to rule over society. This was changed to the question of the rule of the people, but it was not totally there. It's not totally there even today. Otherwise, there would be no discussions about the role of religion in society. Now, the Islamic world cannot rely upon the Western experience and just co-opt it for itself. The Western experience was based on certain Christian theses. The papacy did not play the same role as the caliphate. Neither did the kings of Europe play the same role. The relationship between the spiritual and political authority in the West was not identical with that of the Islamic world. And therefore, this issue is one that Muslims have to confront. And there's a lot of shouting going on, a lot of people shouting in the streets and so forth. But that's not going to solve anything. There has to be an intellectual discourse which will bring out for Muslims themselves, also benefiting from the experience of the West, both positive and negative. Let us not forget Oliver Cromwell. Let us not forget the witches burned in Salem. Let us not forget all that occurred until we've gotten today. And let's not forget Jerry Falwell right now in 2005 in the United States. To make use of all of these experiences, but the formulation has to be an Islamic formulation of this fundamental question of who rules. Who is the ruler? Islam, of course, cannot forfeit the idea that al-mulku lillah, that God is the ruler of all things. And for the case of Islam, is the question of vicegerency, the Khalifatullah fil ard in the Quran, which Professor McLean brought out, which has to be developed, as in fact it was done philosophically by many earlier figures such as Farabi and the like, but in a new light of the situation in which we find ourselves. Closely related to this is an issue that is very much debated in America today, and unfortunately is through a particular lens of Western experience that the Islamic view is being appraised in the West, and that is the relationship between divine law and human law. This is a crucial matter without which politics cannot function. There is no political order without law. And so the philosophy of law is closely associated with political philosophy, obviously. So closely that the Greek word nomos, which in Greek means order, which Plato uses for cosmic law, became so Arabized and Muslimized that we use the word namus in Arabic, which is the Arabization of the Greek word nomos, as divine law. We say nawamisa anbiya, and around the people go on pulpit, and in the Arab world is used all the time in Arabic as well as Persian and I'm sure other Islamic languages. That shows the significance of the idea of law for Islam, that even the Platonic idea of law was incorporated and totally Muslimized as to become identified practically with the Sharia. In the ordinary mind of a Muslim today, when you say namus or nawamis of God, we think of God's laws. We don't use it in human terms. Now, the experience of Islam in this field is very different from that of Christianity in this particular situation. Christianity had to develop a law outside of the direct teachings of Christ in order to run human society. The teachings of Christ were purely spiritual instructions of the highest order about humility, goodness, love of the neighbor and of God, the two great commandments of Christ, God, love, and God, the neighbor. Love the neighbor, love God and love the neighbor. These remain the central teachings of Christ, turning the other cheek, which unfortunately many Christians have forgotten. They only have one cheek today. Many people, one should slap that cheek to get banged on the head with a gun. But the teaching of Christ was to turn the other cheek, obviously. But there was no teachings about economic life, social life. And so when Christianity, destined by God to become not the religion of a few fishermen, but of a whole civilization, became the founding principle and presiding idea and spiritual form and presence of Western civilization, it had to develop law. And it took over Roman law in the south, common law in the north, and combinations thereof. And so there was never an organic relationship between the religion and the laws of the world. It was always between moral laws of the individual and of the spirit. In Islam, in contrast, as we all know, law is practically associated with the heart of religion itself. It's as important in Islam, as I've always said, as theology is in Christianity, not law is in Christianity. In a sense, you cannot be a serious Christian without understanding Christian theology, accepting some theological formulations. You cannot be a serious Muslim or a serious Jew. Judaism is very close to Islam in this matter without accepting the law of God, the halakha or the sharia. Now, we live in a world in which these certitudes have been broken. They were broken very strongly in the case of law, Dr. Ahmad, precisely from the colonial period. If not in the case of science, we were just debating this the other minute. It's the coming of the colonial powers and then the emulation by so-called Muslim governments of the colonial powers that broke the hold of Islamic law upon Islamic societies and has left all Islamic societies in a crisis, including places like Iran, which after 25 years has not been able to promulgate completely the Sharia law. It's still working on it. The banks are not according to Islamic economics yet, but some banks are. People are working on it. It's a very, very difficult issue for the Islamic world because after a century and a half of the experience of the Tanzimat, laws in Iran, in Egypt, and India, and so forth and so on, to be able to have a political order based on laws, because politics has to be based on some laws, but laws which are at once divine laws and also human laws, in the sense that we live in a human society in which we have to have laws which are not necessarily existent in the traditional body of Islamic law. And so the whole question of fiqh, of not only jurisprudence itself, but the methods of jurisprudence, how to apply the principles, these are, of course, legal issues. Very, very prominent figures such as Ayatollah Zanjani, who's with us here, and many other scholars also in the Sunni world, have worked on this. But what has not been worked on, and which has been so much debated, and the Islamic world is being attacked all the time for this, is the philosophy of law. What is it that underlies the Islamic belief that God is the ultimate shari', that is the ultimate lawgiver, which is exactly what Orthodox Judaism believes God to be? In this issue, Islam and Judaism are very, very close together. And how is this related to running a state in our world today? Now, my time is running out, and I just want to finish some of these issues to give you a chance to ask questions. The question of justice. Many thinkers in the world today say, in the Islamic world, that if a government is just, it's Islamic. Is that true? Christians also believe that governments should be just. So do Buddhists, so do Hindus. Justice is a very, very primary quality for all religions. There's no religion that's preached unjust government. At least I do not know of any. Even if it appears to us to be unjust, they thought it was just from their point of view. And therefore, again, a philosophical issue, intellectual issue, which the Islamic thinkers today have to face is, what does Islamic justice mean? Not in the abstract, but in a concrete order, concrete political order. And there, on the basis of that, what defines an order to be Islamic? Please listen to what I've said carefully. This is a very, very important issue. What makes a government an Islamic government? I don't think you will disagree with the fact that this is one of the most important questions in the world today. Every day, many lives are spilled over this. Much blood is spilled every day as we sit here over this one single question. What makes a government an Islamic government? Is it justice? Is it the application of the Sharia? Is it economic fair play? And 100 other questions. I am not a specialist in this field. But my own field of specialty, which is Islamic philosophy, I usually know what the literature is. I have not read a single work in any language that I'm competent of reading, and I read several languages, Western languages and Islamic languages, in which this issue, so crucial, has really been discussed, except on the basis of dogmatism. Well, I can say anyone who follows, let's say, Ja'fari law, that's an Islamic government. But somebody would say, oh, but Ja'fari law says so-and-so, and that part of the government isn't doing it. Or somebody would say Shafi'i law in Egypt, and so forth and so on. It's a very, very important issue. And we have not faced it, let's face it. Finally, there's a very subtle, important issue. And that is the role of political concern on a global scale for Islamic political thought and philosophy. Bear me out again. We live in a world today in which political issues outside of the Islamic world affect the political life of Islam. That's quite obvious. Same-sex marriage and abortion determine the future of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the future of Saddam Hussein, the future of Ethna Ashari Shiism and Sunnism in Iraq. I don't think I have to say anything more, because probably had these issues not been there, another administration would have been in power in Washington, and we would have very different policies, and something else would have happened. There are many, many issues of this kind. That is, Islam cannot remain impervious, Islamic thinkers, to what's going on in the world. Every Islamic political philosophy that is going to be formulated today has to be cognizant of this interrelation that exists globally, that it was going on in the world globally. It cannot function as if we're living in the Seljuk period, or in even the Ottoman and Safavid periods, where there were ambassadors exchanged with England and France, but they had no relevance to what was going on within those Islamic political orders. This brings up the whole question of globalization, interactions, passive and active modes of interacting. The Islamic world is, for the most part, in the passive side of things. Whatever ism has come up since the 19th century in the West has found followers in the Islamic world, not serious followers, but followers, all the way from 19th century liberalism to the coming of Marxism and socialism, and now we're back to liberalism and democracy without really defining what it means. Everybody talks about it. But that's the reason, is that in this, we have not had the privilege and the historical opportunity which the West had in this way. The West developed its political thought and institutions at a time when another civilization was not breathing down its neck.